I would love to hear your memorial remembrance by text or live of someone you loved that served in World War II. They do not have to have served on D-Day, but certainly if you have a story to tell there, that's fine as well. I mentioned my father, Ralph Cochran, Army Air Corps. Ended up serving with a small platoon of guys with sidearms to clear out caves and jungle overgrowth on Tinian and Saipan after the war for Japanese soldiers who didn't know the war was over.
Sure.
Wow.
So, and that's part of the amazing story of D-Day, are folks who were serving a particular job in service and then were called into action they never thought they would see in their time. General John Borling is a good friend and a hero and a patriot and a man who was but a boy of about, I don't do the math here, were you about 4 years old on D-Day?
4 years old would be very accurate, right.
Do you have any remembrance of that day? Anything fresh in your head, in your mind?
You know, the days you remember from way back there are the BE Day, VJ Day. You remember the rationing, going through the stores and looking at the things you couldn't get because you didn't have the ration cards, and your mother saying "Intararabara say," which means just look, don't touch, and so it's a series of useful vignettes, I guess, is the way I would put it. But such is the history of warfare and the history of today. There are relevant stories, all wonderfully individualistic, depending upon who you're talking to, and I'm glad to be talking to you today. Thank you.
Well, General Borling, on that day, when thousands and thousands and thousands of troops landed at Golden, Juneau, and Sword, and Utah, and Omaha, not knowing if they would see the sun set that day, these were 18, 19, and 20-year-olds by majority. It's hard to imagine that now. It's hard to imagine anything equivalent to that now.
Well, you'd like to think that if the trumpets sound with a certain sound that people will respond to the challenge or to the battle. But there was no question that the 150,000 or so that landed, actually 169,000 who landed on D-Day across the channel, which varied in width from the shortest area being Calais, 21 miles, and we did a fake there so that the Germans would be out of step with respect to defenses. Now, actually, they had a fortified coast, and you talk about that 25 miles of beaches. You named the 5 beaches exactly, with Omaha being the longest at 6 miles, and that's where the 1st Infantry Division went ashore. So one little fact, of those 169,000 that landed that day, the remaining survivors of World War II in the United States number less than that, about 120,000. So we're coming to the end of that generation, and a generation that we owe so much to.
Yeah, General, you bring up a good point there. My uncle landed on the beaches of Normandy. Didn't talk about it much. I do know that he was there. He's no longer here with us to talk about it. And so it's up to us to remember or to listen, to learn the history lessons from our family and those that are gone. But talk about the veterans that are there today in France, marking this anniversary. They're 100 years old plus. Not many made the trip, but talk about the importance to them. Now, I don't know if they've been back before, but for them to go back at this point on this day.
Well, anyone who's walked the beaches of Normandy, those 5 beaches that Steve mentioned, and I have had the honor, and then basically scaling the heights, everything from Pointe d'Oc to through the hedgerows and up into the hills and doing the breakout stuff. Old soldiers remember their old battlefields. I mean, I've gone back to a few of mine. Steve, you mentioned Tinian and Saipan. I've in fact been there as well, and those that jungle circumstance, as you rightly say, the Japanese didn't even know the war was over, and some fought on for years.
Yep.
And would come out in Guam, come out of the mountains absolutely mystified that somehow Japan had lost the war. So our esteemed combat veterans are going to be back there and honored today. But I think, Steve, you got it right. You mentioned this at Memorial Day when you kicked off the ceremony at the Logan statue. We thank you for taking the time out of your busy schedule. You're
honored to be there.
So many people, but it's the remembrance, and it's the rededication that I think comes from doing this. I'm wearing medals today just in honor of the D-Day guys and the World War II generation. I dispute and would offer up that they can't be the greatest generation, however.
And that is?
Well, that means our best days are behind us.
Oh, well said. Well said.
I think they were a great generation, a standard-setting generation. But if we don't strive for something more, something better of our own people, of our own contributions, then I worry about the future of America.
Yeah, and we got to get along enough to talk to each other, even when we disagree, as you said on that Memorial Day. This year's Memorial Day celebration. You know, what I was struck by, because I've had the honor of being on those beaches just last year, and I encourage anybody of any age to do it. But the irony of the quiet is what struck me. The Normandy American Cemetery is, you could hear a pin drop. But when you're standing on the beach outside of the crashing of the waves, it's just your silence, your thoughts, and your respect for those who gave so much for the rest of us. You counterbalance that against the noise of that day and the noise of that day that went on for weeks that had to happen to end the war. It's just a very bizarre thing when you're there and it's so quiet. And you can't imagine how noisy that day must have been.
Well, you're absolutely right. And it's in that silence that if you try to distill things in your mind. And I come back to just one word: steel.
Well, and that's exactly right.
It has so many meanings. It's the steel of spirit and of will that was required. But if you go, as you have again at Normandy, and you see on Omaha Beach, les braves, the brave ones, the stainless steel sculpture that depicts brotherhood, depicts hope, the French concept of fraternité, that marvelous structure that actually at high tide, the base is underwater of those wings, if you will, stretching to the sky. So I think of that Steele. I think of John Steele. You know who John Steele is?
No, who's John Steele?
In Illinois. He's the guy that got hung up on the chapel at St. Mary's.
Oh, yeah. The parachute landed on the steeple.
Yeah, well, there were actually three of them, but he was the one that was highest. They cut him down. He was wounded. They captured him, but he escaped later in the day and made it back to the lines, to our friendly lines. And John Steele became somewhat of an iconic figure because of that. There were actually two first things that happened early in the morning of June 6th. One, the airborne assault on St. Mary Glees, which was a node, a transportation node that they needed to hold to allow breakout eventually. And then the Brits down south took on Operation Pegasus off of their beach, off of Sword, I believe, and they had to secure the bridge. This it's not a drawbridge; it's a swing bridge over what we would call the Caen, C-A-E-N Canal.
Yep.
And they did so. And in fact, the Brits argue that they had the first casualties of the war, and they were first there. But it was two simultaneous things early in the morning. The order that was given the Brits is an interesting order, and it's historically famous.
The amazing thing.
Yeah, so I want to finish this. The order given was hold until relieved. How's that?
Well, yeah, that's fairly clear. And I want to mention, too, that John Steele depicted by red buttons in The Longest Day. The Longest Day, that amazing 1962 film about the D-Day invasion, which, you know, if you're ever going to make that trip, watch it before, watch it after, but watch it. Listen, I know you're on your way to a speech. I've never asked you this. What inspired you, or whom, I should say, who inspired you to join the military? Was it a family member or your own personal calling? What was it?
Well, you know, I wear that ring that my uncle wore when he was a B-24 type in World War II. And actually wore when he got out of POW camp. The bombardier, who was a dentist, made this ring with the officer crest on it. So my Uncle Dick, more like he was a kid brother to my dad, who was, my dad was recalled in early 44 at Fort Sheridan. My dad was horse cavalry, Steve.
How about that?
Wow.
And they were trotting around with their horses at Fort Sheridan, and the colonel came out when colonels had such power and said, "What are you doing?" They said, "Well, we've been recalled." He said, "Put the horses away, go back home. If they recall you again, don't come."
You know...
So yeah, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say the stories that you have just from your time and your career and your life would fill 100 books. But it's just an honor to always have you on to talk about things like this.
Absolutely.
I know you got to run to a speech, but thank you for doing that. Give our best to the Kiwanis this morning.
Yeah, well, they do worthy things, and we're gonna talk a lot about D-Day. You know, I'll just finish with this thought, because you've done this. You've taken tours to Europe. Mm-hmm. and done the Normandy thing. I delight in telling unsuspecting audiences that I speak to that I take a good deal of pride in taking virgins to France, and that they do not long remain in that state.
And even
wait a minute. Let me finish.
Go ahead.
Yeah. Where I take them is to the American Military Cemetery.
Oh, of course, yes.
People who've never been there. So Normandy and my favorite, my private place over in eastern France, which is in a lonesome low valley in the province of Lorraine. And it's the Lorraine or Saint-Avold Military Cemetery Memorial with over 10,000 crosses in that little valley. It's the largest World War II cemetery in Europe, larger than Normandy. And it just tears your heart out. I mean, you're so glad you're alone. But so anyway, we'll see how the virgin story works this morning.
I'm sure it'll.
That's all you're going to remember out of this conversation.
No, I'm sure it's going to be as good as always.
June 6, 1944, the longest day, but not when you're listening to Steve Cochran and his buddy.
There you go. All right, thank you, my friend. Thank you, General.
Thanks, General.
Thank you for all you've done and all you continue to do every day as he continues to work for the country that he served his entire life.